All right, ready to dive in. This time we're taking on the Rockford Files. And not just the surface stuff, we're going deep. You guys sent in a ton of great articles and insights about the show.
It's amazing how a show from decades ago still holds up.
Yeah.
Even people who haven't seen it seem to get the references.
Totally. It's like it's part of the DNA of television. But what's the secret? Why does the Rockford Files still resonate today? Let's start with the man himself, James Garner. It's kind of crazy, right? He did Maverick and The Rockford Files, both created by Roy Huggins. Talk about range.
Right. It really reflects a huge shift happening in television back then. Westerns, which were king for so long, started to fade out. And in their place, you get these gritty crime dramas. Audiences wanted something different, heroes who reflected the times.
Yeah, and the late 60s and 70s were something else, right? One article mentioned this whole rise of the anti-hero, think Clint Eastwood and Dirty Harry. These weren't your typical good guys, more like good guys who played by their own rules.
Exactly. And that's where Rockford gets really interesting. He wasn't a saint, not by a long shot. But he wasn't some cynical, burnt-out case either, like a lot of those anti-heroes. What really drove Jim Rockford was this hatred of injustice. He did the right thing because it was the right thing to do, plain and simple, not for glory or money.
Right. There's a real sense of, like, he's got a strong moral compass, even if he bends the rules sometimes. You can almost imagine him butting heads with, like, Joe Friday from Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am, versus I gotta do what I gotta do.
And he did it all with a smirk and that cool guy Pontiac Firebird.
Talk about a ride. It actually makes me think about something I found really cool in all this research. A lot of folks were saying that watching the Rockford Files was like reading a modern-day detective novel. They even compared it to authors like Raymond Chandler.
Yeah, Chandler. The Big Sleep, total classic. Atmosphere for days, and the details, man. The Rockford Files uses a similar trick. It's not just about the mystery itself, it's about the world building, You're not just watching a case, you're figuring out Rockford's world right alongside him.
Oh, I like that. Like we're his partner trying to piece together the clues.
Exactly. That chipped mug on his desk, the way some small-time crook talks, those aren't accidents. They're clues, part of a bigger picture, and the show trusts you enough to put it all together.
And on top of that, they somehow managed to make it funny. Like, the stakes are real, things matter, but it never feels heavy-handed. Not an easy thing to pull off.
Definitely. The Rockford Files walks that line beautifully. You really see it in the dialogue, the characters, all those crooks, mobsters. There's like something out of a comic book, but in a good way.
Yeah.
You never knew what to expect next, but it always worked.
Speaking of unexpected, can we talk about those writers for a second? Cannell, Bartlett, Chase, to have all three of them on one show is unheard of. And not just that, they managed to keep their vision consistent over all those seasons. That's almost crazier than the plots themselves.
Each of them brought something unique. Cannell with his encyclopedic knowledge of crime. Like, the guy knew everything, plus he was a master of suspense. Then you've got Bartlett with this almost Hitchcockian sense of mystery and morality. And Chase, well, we see where his dark humor went with The Sopranos, right?
Yeah.
But you can see those early hints of it in the Rockford Files. Fascinating to see how his style developed.
And it's funny you mentioned The Sopranos because I was reading that a bunch of the actors from the Rockford Files popped up on The Sopranos too.
It's wild, right? Like a whole mini reunion.
Seriously. Shows you how much talent was involved with the Rockford Files, both in front of the camera and behind it. Which, speaking of, one of the articles mentioned something interesting about the show's production. Apparently, the writers had this really tough producer who shielded them from any studio interference.
That's huge. You don't hear that very often, especially in television.
Right. They had total creative freedom, and that really shines through, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's one of those things that makes the Rockford Files really special. They were making the show they wanted to make, not what some executive thought it should be.
Exactly. And it shows in all these great little details, like all those running gags about food. Remember those?
Oh, yeah. Rockford and his endless appetite. Classic.
Like one article mentioned the blue plate special at the diner, the one that came with the free wig.
Oh, man, that's a good one.
It's those kinds of touches that make it so rewatchable, It's more than just a good mystery. It's a whole vibe.
Totally. You really feel like you're stepping into Rockford's world. It's familiar, lived in, but always a little bit unpredictable.
Right. And speaking of unpredictable, how about all the different crooks and mobsters he went up against? I swear, every episode there was a new one.
Talk about a rogues gallery. You never knew who was going to show up next or what crazy scheme they'd be running.
It's true, but that's part of what makes it so much fun. And you know what else I love? Rockford's uncanny ability to talk his way out of any jam, he was forever going up against those, like, bureaucratic brick walls.
Right. He was always outsmarting someone. It's like he could charm the pants off anybody, even if they were trying to throw him in jail.
And he had to. This one article called them Berlin Wall Guardians, all those officials and bureaucrats trying to block his path. He couldn't just flash a badge and expect results, you know?
Totally. He had to use his wits and his charm,
Oh.
which I think makes him a much more interesting character, don't you think?
Definitely. Way more relatable than some straight-laced, by-the-book detective. And speaking of relatable, we gotta talk about those answering machine messages. What a genius way to start every episode, right?
So good. It's like you're right there in his trailer with him, listening in on his life. Ex-wives, angry clients, wrong numbers. It was gold.
Pure gold. And such a perfect snapshot of that era, too.
You're right. The technology itself might seem dated now, but the situations, the humor, it still holds up. Plus, it gave you this great insight into his character. You know, he might have been a wisecracking private eye on the outside, but those messages showed you the real Rockford. Guy struggling to make rent, dealing with loneliness, facing down corruption.
It's true. And despite all that, he never lost his sense of humor.
Never. Even when things were at their worst, he could still crack a joke. Which is probably why people still connect with him today, you know.
Absolutely. He felt real. Flawed, but real. Speaking of which, one article I read mentioned how even Ben Folds, the musician, referenced the Rockford Files in one of his songs. It's like, this show from the 70s is still inspiring artists today.
That's wild.
I know, right? But it speaks to the show's lasting impact.
Definitely. It's that mix of humor, heart, and a little bit of grit that keeps people coming back. It's timeless, you know.
It really is amazing how a show from that era can still feel so relevant today.
Right. It's like it tapped into something universal.
Totally. And you know what else is kind of cool? All this talk about the Rockford Files got me thinking about his car again. That gold Pontiac Firebird, apparently the fans are really picky about which model it was.
Oh, yeah, that's a thing.
Yeah, like it wasn't just any Firebird, it had to be the Firebird.
Right. One of the articles you said actually pointed that out. It was a Firebird Esprit, not the Trans Am like some people think.
It's funny how those little details matter to fans, you know?
Oh, totally. It's like a badge of honor knowing all the ins and outs of a show you love. Right. But, you know, for a guy who supposedly hated violence, Rockford sure did wreck a lot of those Firebirds. All those car chases, man.
Those were legendary. Though, come to think of it, they did kind of add to the realism of the show, you know? I mean,
Totally.
it wasn't like Rockford was driving around in some pristine, expensive sports car. He was a working-class guy with a car that took a beating, just like him.
Exactly. It's like another way he was relatable. He wasn't some high-flying detective with an endless budget. He was just a guy trying to make a living, fight the good fight, and, yeah, maybe dent the Firebird a few times along the way.
Which I think brings us back to that big question one of your articles posed. Why does a character like Jim Rockford still resonate with us today, especially in a world with so many dark and gritty crime dramas?
That's a good question. And I gotta say, it's got me thinking. Maybe it's because he represents something we all crave, you know? That sense of someone who's good, even when it's tough. Totally. He wasn't perfect. Not even close. He cut corners, he got frustrated, he complained about being broke all the time. But at his core, you knew Rockford was a good guy, just trying to do the right thing.
Plus, he never took himself too seriously. Always had that dry wit about him, even when things were falling apart.
So true. That's one of my favorite things about him. He could find humor in any situation, even when he was dodging bullets or getting chewed out by a client.
He did have some classic lines, like that one, "This is my profession, lady, I don't make house calls." I love that one.
So good. He could be gruff and cynical on the surface, but you always knew there was a good heart under there.
Exactly. So what's the takeaway here? I think the Rockford Files gave us something special. A show that was fun and smart, full of heart, but never afraid to get real, and with characters who felt like people you might actually meet.
Perfectly said. It reminds us that even with all the choices out there, all the shows vying for our attention, there's still those gems that can surprise you. Those shows that stick with you long after you've seen the last episode.
And the Rockford Files is definitely one of those gems. It's a classic for a reason. Well, folks, there you have it. Another deep dive complete. We've explored the origins of the Rockford Files, its lasting impact, and what makes it so darn rewatchable. Hopefully you've walked away with a deeper appreciation for this iconic show and its place in TV history. And as always, keep those deep dive requests coming. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep on watching.